Hello and welcome to this webcast introducing David Price. David, over to you.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. My name is David Price, Vice President of Business Development, TV and Media at Ericsson, and one of the founders and now a board member of the Ultra HD Forum. Before we get into the webinar, we'd like to quickly introduce you to the Ultra HD Forum. Our industry recognized 10 or more years ago that we were no longer tied to the cathode ray tube, and we started reaching for standards that would make the next generation TV viewing experience radically different. Now we have a whole array of technologies and emerging standards that will make that step possible. However, many of us recognized early on that it would take some leadership and organized advocacy in the industry to manage that step. So a few years back, a few of us started engaging and talking about the concept of a forum where we could accelerate and advance the conversation and provide a valuable source of information and accelerate the interoperability of the components of an end-to-end delivery chain. As you can see, we've now grown to 38 members, and we continue to add members each and every week. So this is where we are complementary to, but different from the UHD Alliance. Our focus is broad and reaches across the entire ecosystem. And together with the UHD Alliance, we will bring ultra-high definition and all its related technologies to a successful introduction into the market. We have been busy and will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. We plan on having events, as you can see, at both CES and at NAB, where we hope to see you there. For more information, please visit www.ultrahdforum.org. With that, I'd like you now to pass you back to your moderator, Barry Flynn.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Today's webinar is about ultra-high definition TV. But what exactly is it? At the moment, that question isn't very easy to answer. There are UHD, often called 4K, TV sets in the shops, but it's clear that these screens, which offer roughly 4 times the resolution of an HD display, are just the first step along a path that, so we are led to expect, will offer an experience so immersive that it represents a transition for viewers just as radical as the switch from black and white to color. And to do that, there will be a whole range of new features being called into play that current 4K displays don't generally offer. These include high dynamic range, which essentially increases the contrast available so we get whiter whites, blacker blacks, and more of everything in between. Wide color gamut, which allows TV sets to show a much, much wider palette of colors. 10-bit sampling, which allows us to exploit the previous 2 features by making more information available to each pixel. High frame rates, which essentially result in sharper moving objects on the screen, and next-generation audio, which means sound that is both three-dimensional and personalizable. While we have an idea of which of these new features will probably come first, it looks like a combination of HDR, wide color gamut, and 10-bit sampling, known as HDR+, it's unclear how the rest will fit in what time frame, and in many cases, whose particular system will be adopted. The next version of the UHD TV standard might even see HDR or HDR+ attached to an HD profile like 1080p. So, the object of this webinar is to cast light on what is a pretty complex, not to say confused, situation for the industry. And who better to do that than a bunch of top experts who live and breathe this stuff every day. They are Matthew Goldman, Senior Vice President, Technology, TV Compression at Ericsson, who'll be talking about what the various standards organizations like SMPTE, MPEG, DVB, and the CEA are up to. Skip Pitsey, Senior Director of New Media Technologies at the National Association of Broadcasters, NAB, who'll describe how North American terrestrial broadcasters are planning to incorporate UHD into the ATSC standard. And Nandu Nandakumar, Senior Vice President at the LG Technology Center of America, who will discuss how the consumer electronics industry is working to meet the needs of consumers with respect to interoperability. After these three gentlemen have said their piece, we'll welcome a representative from the BBC who will join the panel for the question and answer session at the end to represent the broadcaster's point of view, and I'll introduce him later. Meanwhile, for the audience, do feel free to submit questions of your own. You'll see that you have the facility to do so when logged into this live event. And just to let everyone know, we've been given an extra 15 minutes, so we'll aim to wrap this up at 4:15 p.m. UK time, 8:15 a.m. Pacific time. So let's start with Matthew's contribution. Matthew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. And welcome everybody to the webinar here. And my portion will be focusing on the Standards Development Organization perspectives, what recent activities are happening in the area of Ultra HD. And as Barry had briefly mentioned earlier, when you think of what next generation or future television is about, it's really about the immersive viewing experience. And there are 6 areas that come to mind for that. Most people, when they hear about Ultra HD, they immediately, of course, know about 4K or possibly 8K resolution, which is image resolution, but that's just one of the 6 areas. We have high dynamic range, we have wide color gamut, we have higher sample precision, which allows us to, as Barry had quickly noted, to be able to represent HDR and WCG much more precisely without having visible banding being shown. We have high frame rate, and of course we have immersive audio as well. And immersive audio actually includes ability to do personalization in the audio section as well. Where most of the recent activities have been around Ultra HD, because we're already moving into Phase 2 now, Phase 1 for Ultra HD, which is centered around mostly around the spatial resolution that already exists. So most of the new areas going in these next 3 areas combined together, which is high dynamic range, wide color gamut, and higher sample precision. The combination of these 3 areas together offers a lot of, shall we say, a bang for the bit, where you get a much better viewing experience to the audience at the same time without taking up much more bandwidth that is needed currently. Obviously, when you go from HD to 4K, it's a significant amount of more bandwidth, but it's not that much for these, shall we call them together, HDR plus areas, and it becomes a much more immersive viewing experience independent of the spatial resolution. So just to give some background of where the HDR standards have been, in the Society of Motion Pictures and Television Engineers, there are 2 published standards that are used quite commonly as baseline standards to build on the HDR Plus ecosystem. And that is SMPTE Standard 2084, which is commonly called the perceptual quantizer view of viewing high dynamic range. And it's defined as being display preferred in a transfer curve that converts basically electrical signals on or a bit stream into optics that can be displayed on there. And this curve is, in current television, commonly known as the gamma curve, but we don't need to worry about that. That's just for those that know what that is to understand where this fits. But it really is about representing absolute brightness and luminance values based on a human visual model. And it's done with a specific amount of absolute brightness in mind, which is hence why it's called displayed referred. There's another standard that SMPTE has published as well, known as SMPTE Standard 2086, which is basically a set of static metadata features to be able to pass forward or give information to the rest of the ecosystem about what exactly was done about that mastering display. So it includes the primaries, the white point, and the minimum max luminance so that it can be correctly represented by downstream equipment. And what is being worked on currently, and it's not a standard yet, but it's in process, is a way of doing dynamic metadata that is content dependent. And for a way of properly representing this color volume, again, the color volume being the combination of high dynamic range, which is a contrast, along with a wider color gamut or more realistic colors and a 10-bit sampling precision, onto a display what might have a smaller color volume, and this will give a proper mapping so that the artistic intent can be maintained. There was a second approach to doing high dynamic range that was standardized by ARRIVE, which is a Japanese standard body, but has been commonly used throughout the world right now, and that is known as ARRIVE Standard B67, which defines a different way of doing this, which was a joint proposal from the BBC and NHK, and it's known as hybrid log gamma. And in this particular case, you have a similar type of a curve done before, except that in this case it's scene referred, and it works on relative luminance values. There's no metadata needed because it's display independent, and therefore in many cases it's compatible with an SDR display. Both hybrid log gamma and perceptual quantizer, which is SMPTE standard 2084 that gets covered, are alternative ways of representing high dynamic range. Each of these mechanisms have advantages as well as disadvantages over each other, and they both provide a good way of representing high dynamic range in an end-to-end ecosystem. So with that in mind, we have also the ITUR under Working Party 6C that's defining ways of parameters for production and international program exchange using HDR. And because there's these two popular systems that each have advantages in their own right, the ITUR is looking at a way of coming up with a common reference transfer function, which they're calling the optical transfer function, or OOTF, in order to be able to represent an end-to-end approach of this, and thereby provide a way of both supporting either of these systems, whether or not it's the perceptual quantizer or the hybrid log gamma solution. And this picture, which I want to thank BBC for providing this, it basically provides a way of describing how you can go from scene light at one end, which is on the left, to display light at the other through an end-to-end ecosystem that includes compression while maintaining artistic adjustments, and that this is a way that you can map between these systems as well by doing this. So the good news is that these standards are in progress now. We're hoping to have most of these completed by the end of 2016 so that it can enter into the Phase 2 systems, which I'll talk about in a second. We also have, of course, in order to deliver video to the end user, most of us do not have the 12 gigabits per second or more that might be needed to do Ultra HD. So we needed to have a very, very high compression system available for direct-to-consumers or direct-to-home environments. And MPEG and VKEG, the Moving Picture Experts Group and the Video Coding Experts Group, have long been known at providing these things. And the newest standard of that is known as high-efficiency video coding, sometimes called MPEG-H or H.265. And what was been found is when you provide a high dynamic range and wide color gamut to this at very low bitrate applications, they had some issues with HEVC where it did not perform as expected. It needed higher bit rates because to overcompensate for color shifts after compression or color boundary overflows or some other poor texture renditions and representations. So a call for evidence was done earlier this year, and test results reviewed mid-year, and it was found that there were statistically significant improvements that were possible over this without, and this is key, without changing the baseline model of HEVC, so all the decoders that are out there don't have to be done. So it was split into two pieces. One is known as a fast track to create a test model for rapid HEVC standardization. In other words, it will be an amendment to the existing standard, but doesn't, again, affect fielded decode devices, and is expected to be technically complete by the end of next year. And then, of course, this also begs, there's always looking for a call for proposals for a broader codec for the next generation codec, and this will spin off into that activity as well. While all this has been happening on the consumer side, there's been two groups, the Blu-Ray Disc Association as well as the Consumer Technology Association. For those that aren't familiar, the Consumer Electronics Association recently, just a week or so ago, renamed themselves to the Consumer Technology Association. And what they've been working on, of course, is next generation Blu-ray or over-the-top type of productions, and so for Hollywood productions, things like that. And very commonly, this has been referred to, and you might have heard this, as the HDR10 media profile. And it's a way of representing HDR in motion pictures such that it's coded with a particular stream. There's some metadata that comes along with that, and then the receive device can render that correctly at the other end by using this. And these TVs and Blu-ray disc players are out for this holiday season that's just approaching us. And of course, that's not enough time to go through this in detail, but you can see the different parameters in here. And it's interesting to note that the baseline standard for doing high dynamic range here is the SMPTE standard 2084 that I mentioned before, as well as the SMPTE standard 2086 static metadata with a few additions on there for the HDR representations only. And it covers both Ultra HD 4K as well as HD using this. So I think it's important to point out again that high dynamic range, wide color gamut, and the deeper sampling precision, what we were calling HDR plus for short, that is independent of the spatial resolution and equally applies as well as an enhancement to HD. So where is broadcast UHD going out? We just talked about where Hollywood was doing that. And so where we are in 2014 and 2015 is in UHD1 Phase 1, as it's known. And that was really about coming up with 4 times the spatial resolution. In other words, moving from 1920 by 1080 for HD to 3840 by 2160 for 4K, or UHD1. And that has been well in the field. There's been a couple of generations of years of televisions that are out there for that, and there are some over-the-top or streaming services that have been using this format for a while. The next phase, which is known as UHD1 Phase 2, actually has 2 separate conformance points. It has conformance point A, which is the HDR+, and conformance point B, which is high frame rate. And this is split because of it's a lot more effort in the end-to-end delivery change, particularly on the production side, to change the frame rate from the high of 50 or 60 frames per second today to 100 or 120 frames per second of tomorrow. So the Phase 2 conformance point A is for the 2017-2018 time frame, and that's the orange you see on here. And then the Phase 2 performance point B for higher frame rate is for the for the 2019 and 2020 frame rate. Now, this is based on the work that the DVB has been doing, but it's very similar for the ATSC, the Advanced Television System Committee, as well as for Society of Cable Telecommunications Engineers and ARRIVE as well, all discussing the next generation TV. They're still work in progress. The standards are still coming out, but at least the commercial requirements are mostly known or done, and we're hoping, again, by the second half of next year, all this will be settled out, and therefore Phase 2 can be in fruition in 2017 and 2018. And I'd like to turn it over to Skip.
Okay, thanks, Matthew, and hello, everyone. Thanks to Barry and to David for their comments earlier. I'm with NAB, as was mentioned, and we're proud to be a member, charter member of the Ultra HD Forum. I just want to speak for a minute here or two about the ATSC specifically and what U.S. broadcasters and perhaps by extensions of North American broadcasters are working on in terms of the things that Matthew had just mentioned regarding Ultra HD. It's an important piece of the ATSC 3.0 standard. That's the standard that, if you haven't heard of it, is under development right now for really revising the digital TV in general for the ATSC environment and perhaps beyond. It is a second generation digital TV standard, if you will, and it's really revising end-to-end on the system, that is including the RF technology as well as the in-between technology, the transport technology, moving away from MPEG-2 transport stream to an IP-based layer there, and of course improving the application and presentation layer as well, and that includes audio improvements, video improvements, and perhaps some additional interactivity and personalization capabilities, and improved accessibility, as well as perhaps improved emergency alerting as well, all things that broadcasting brings to the consumer, and we hope to improve all facets of those. Certainly, UHD is among them. In fact, it's, I would think, preeminent among them for both the video and audio. So we have, for about the last 5 years, been working on this system, going back to the planning process and the requirements phase. And as a result of that, we've come up with a lot of requirements, system requirements we call them, for higher video resolutions, including the HDR and wide color gamut and high frame rate that Matthew just explained. We also include the support for legacy systems as well, of course, in the ATSC 3.0 format. HD and SD video will still be carried. We expect that to be a transition over time, just as SD to HD went. There's still some SD out there. We expect to see a lot of HD to continue for the next several years, or the first few years of the UHD environment, as well as perhaps even some SD stuff still being out there. And of course, as Matthew listed, the kind of the other element, the non-video element of Ultra HD or UHD, is the improved audio. And the improved audio, as Matthew noted, includes both immersiveness, that is more channels, if you will, a more surrounding environment to the listener. We started, of course, back with mono, which defined a single point, and we moved to stereo, which defined a line or any point across a line between the two speakers in front of the listener. We moved to 5.1 with HD TV, and that defines a plane around the listener with the listening position in the middle of that plane. And immersive sound would define a complete three-dimensional space, a cube, if you will, with the listener in the middle of that. So any point in that sphere or cube space around the listener could be defined and accessed to the best of the reproduction system's ability. And that's one of the key points that the immersive sound allows the system to accommodate a wide range of speaker placements. We don't expect people to be drilling holes in their ceiling and installing speakers all over the room. There are limits, of course, to that, but we do expect the system to be able to address those if they did exist, and to sort of fold down and accommodate lesser numbers of speakers and placements, and still give a convincing soundtrack and reproduce the producer's intent. Virtualization is a key part of that. The rendering of sound through sound bars or other kinds of tricks is likely to be part of that. The personalization element is a key element of it as well, and that's the idea that the user could adjust elements of the sound. That is, pick a different language of the dialogue, perhaps enhance the dialogue so that it's a little bit louder than the background that some folks might want, whereas others would like to have the original level of background sound relative to the dialogue. Things like this. To add a director's commentary, as we can do on DVDs, for example, and even to pull in sound elements from the internet through the broadband connection that the television set or set-top box receiver might also share. So there are a lot of elements of both immersion and personalization that improve the sound as well in Ultra HD. And these are all parts of the ATSC 3.0 system as defined by its requirements and currently being enabled through the specifications and standards that are being developed in ATSC 3.0. We have also the element of layering in the system so that these things can be improved independently. And both the audio and the video teams that are developing systems right now are working towards making sure that the system is extensible and adaptable over time, because a lot of these new technologies and new capabilities are emerging over time. We feel that this is going to be possible to do, and to do with multiple channels of content, multiple elements of content within a single broadcast channel, because the new physical layer of the ATSC 3.0 system will allow higher capacities. The current system, ATSC 1.0, we retrospectively call it now, carries 19.38 megabits per second. The new system will carry 25 to 30 maximum, and it will allow each service to be adjusted with a certain robustness level, so trading off robustness for capacity independently amongst the services in the multiplex suite. And then within that channel, 6 megahertz is used in the U.S., but ATSC 3.0 also addresses 7 and 8 megahertz channels, so it could be applied elsewhere in the world where those wider bandwidths are used. And then, of course, the new codecs that are being used are also more efficient. So the combination of audio and video coding being more efficient on the presentation layer and higher capacity being possible on the physical layer allows UHD to happen and to coexist with HD and SD in a multi-channel scenario, so that a single broadcaster with a single 6 megahertz or 7 or 8 megahertz channel could present one UHD service, for example, and multiple HD and or SD services simultaneously. Moving to the next slide here, aside from what's happening in the standard itself, the broadcasters in the U.S. are already working towards this future time, which we hope to be somewhere in the 2017-18 timeframe to begin for broadcast. Meanwhile, they're stockpiling content. Some of them are recording currently in 4K, and then they have great interest in these other elements that are now just emerging into the professional space, as Matthew mentioned. And in some cases, they feel that the combination of an HD resolution, image resolution, or spatial resolution, as some call it, 1080p, 60 frames per second, plus the HDR and wide color gamut, or the so-called HDR plus elements that Matthew referred to. So 1080p plus, 1080p plus HDR is plus HDR plus, if you will, is a pretty interesting thing for a lot of broadcasters, particularly when you consider that sets already out there, in fact, have pretty good up converters to get the 4K element, and 4K actually takes up a fair amount more in terms of bandwidth in the channel to actually deliver than the HDR plus elements do. So for purposes of efficiency and bang for the bit in terms of bandwidth on the channel, an HD plus HDR plus, kind of a mouthful, but the point being 1080p 60 plus HDR wide color gamut 10-bit is actually a target that a lot of broadcasters are interested in. And so ATSC 3.0 would provide the flexibility to allow those elements to be used independently, so the broadcaster could do that if they wanted to in the future. Finally, the high frame rate appeals to certain elements of the content community, particularly the sports. The cinematic folks are not so necessarily interested in it. They like their 24-frame, 25-frame world, and that will also certainly be supported. But 100, 120 hertz is of great interest to content with a lot of motion, and certainly sports is key among that. And finally, some productions are starting to take advantage of the idea of producing in a mode that could take advantage of the new UHD audio formats, and that is both more channels and objects, as they're called, to create a more immersive sound, as well as delivering content with dialogue being separate from the other elements of the soundtrack to allow the dialogue replacement or dialogue enhancement that the personalization elements might allow, also through the use of object technology in the what we call NGA, or next generation audio environment. So that's a quick look at the U.S. broadcast environment and the ATSC 3.0 world as it stands today regarding Ultra HD. So I'll turn things back now to Nandu to go move into the consumer electronics environment. Thank you. Nandu?
Thank you, Skip. My name is Nandu Nandakumar. I'm with LG Electronics, and what I'd like to do is to provide the CE industry perspective with respect to HDR. As you know, in the CE industry, there are different types of display devices, mobile devices, projectors, monitors, televisions, and in the next few minutes, I'd really like to focus on televisions as the medium of consumption. HDR, in the way it has been used for mobile devices with HDR cameras, is really quite different, and if there is time later during the Q&A, we can discuss that. But primarily, the next few minutes, I'd like to spend on television and the HDR capability of TVs. So at the recent IFA trade show in Berlin, HDR plus Ultra HD was the hot topic. There was news coverage by mainstream media, Forbes, CNBC. There's a large number of these media organizations covered HDR. There were HDR TVs that were announced and demonstrated from several major brands. This consisted of flagship televisions that were announced with the HDR feature, so the feature of HDR added to these TVs, and that was a fairly major category of announcements from the major brands. There were a number of Ultra HD media players with HDR capability that were announced and demonstrated. These included Blu-Ray players, the 4K Blu-ray players with HDR, the Vidity player, again with 4K and HDR. There was a lot of news about content and services. Fox announced their entire future lineup of major releases would be in 4K HDR to the home. Amazon services were being shown. Netflix had their press conference talking about future 4K HDR services. And there were also several technology demonstrations that the EBU, BBC, Astra, and various other entities were showing at the show floor. So HDR was a fairly prominent topic and has been in the recent past. And we think that in 2016, HDR is one of the major feature categories that will be emphasized by the CE industry with respect to televisions, content, and devices that feed televisions. So in addition to the technology and the device manufacturers and the content and services, the sales and distribution channels also are very enthusiastic. They really see that HDR plus Ultra HD provide compelling value to the customer in the demonstrations that they have hosted to end consumers who walk into stores or browse their websites to buy new products. And one concern that they seem to echo in all of the meetings that I was at was that the in-store experience and differentiation will be the key challenge. The consumer really needs to see that compelling value at the point of sale, and the HDR content on a TV needs to look much better than SDR content, and this is a challenge given that SDR TVs do really a very good job of expanding SDR content to fit high brightness displays and using inverse tone map rendering. So it's not all positive. There are some challenges all the way to reaching the consumer and proving that there is value in this service and this type of content. If you look at the past, ever since digital television came onto the scene, TV manufacturers have been investing in significantly in improving the quality of the picture. Most of that investment has been in improving things like the temporal resolution, the frame rate, the frame refresh rate, and the spatial resolution, increasing the number of pixels. And to some extent also the grayscale resolution. Inside the TVs, the pixel processing engines have increased to 12-bit, 16-bit sometimes processing. But we found that there's been a diminishing return on this incremental investment, and moving forward, really the investment needs to be in other axes that would give a higher return on the investment, specifically dynamic range and color volume. And pretty much all the brands have recognized this and are coming out with televisions that have these capabilities of increased dynamic range and color volume. And we've talked about what HDR means, the definition, the color gamut, and so on. So we won't cover that here. Another very important area is really not just the technology or the device, but the content. High quality content is equally important, if not more important, than capture, display, processing, all the technology and all the devices that make up the entire service. And here is where the industry is still in its early learning phases. The cinematographers, the colorists, for them, it is a bit of a learning process. Color grading suites today still employ plasma TVs or LCD TVs that have been calibrated to look like plasma TVs, where the color gamut may be great, but the dynamic range is not yet there. And it's going to take a little bit of time for the colorists to really use this new capability and to make sure that the content has the punch along with the creative intent to deliver this story with this new capability. And quantifying the parameters of a high quality user experience is extremely complex. It's beyond just whether it has a high scene contrast, high local contrast. There are many other aspects of it, and as technology improves on the display side, it's going to be a challenge for the content development folks to really keep up with the technology and make sure they can use it in their storytelling. Another challenge that the CE industry is noticing is that it's not enough just to have high quality studio content in the form of movies that come to the home. It's very important to also have real-time, non-episodic broadcast content in order to have broad spread adoption of this capability. So establishing interoperability across a broad array of content sources, networks, platforms, devices, etc., is really critical to ensure that the next generation of content gets broad adoption. And that's going to help drive sales of devices, infrastructure equipment, platforms, services, and content. And that's essentially the focus of the Ultra HD Forum, and this is the reason why we at LG are very interested in the forum, the mission of the forum, and hope that many people in this industry will get together to promote this end-to-end set of services and technologies. Recently, on August 27th, the CTA, also previously known as the CEA, announced a definition of what a display device should be called, and what should be the elements of it for it to be known as an HDR compatible display. And really, according to them, it should meet the following minimum attributes. Includes at least one interface that supports HDR signaling as defined in CA 861, -F, or extended as by 861.3, it receives and processes static HDR metadata compliant with 861.3. It receives and processes HDR10 media profile from IP, HDMI, or other video delivery sources. And additionally, other media profiles may be supported. This doesn't need to be the only one. And applies an appropriate electro-optical transfer function before rendering the image. Could be PQ, could be something different, something new. That was left open. And the HDR10 media profile is defined as follows, and this was covered by Matt in his presentation. The SMPTE 2084 EOTF, also known as the PQ EOTF, color subsampling 420 for compressed video sources, a bit depth of 10 bits, a BT 2020 color primaries, and SMPTE 2086 metadata plus MaxFall and MaxDLL. So these are the elements of what the CTA has defined to be HDR10. So if this is handled by the display plus the previous elements, then the display may be termed to be an HDR compatible. So it's an interoperability definition, not a definition that is based on the performance of the display, on how bright it is or what the contrast levels are. It's an interoperability based definition. So again, talking about interoperability, the question typically arises, what can existing deployed Ultra HD TVs do with respect to HDR, and what is expected in the roadmap for new products? Well, for deployed products, it's possible to update and add EOTFs, especially in the form of lookup tables. And the CE industry, the TV manufacturers have done that in many cases. The HDR, the PQ EOTF has been added as a software update to TVs. It's very difficult to add features, for example, like new codecs and hardware interfaces, again, given the limitations of silicon that's already been deployed. And so we've seen that this is something that some TV manufacturers have been able to do to some extent, like add the HDMI 2.0A profile in the case where there's silicon available that can be updated, and in many cases where it cannot, this hardware interface has not been updated. Again, what is also possible is potentially to upgrade some of these 4K TVs to add other EOTFs like HLG. Again, because of the ARIB standardization, that is possible. However, today we are not seeing that because there is a pending NHK BBC agreement on the OOTF, and there is no metadata yet specified over HDMI to signal the HLG EOTF, although there's metadata available in the compressed domain stream. So this is something that's pending. It's likely, but it's probably dependent on agreement by these two entities. For new products that will be launched in 2016 and beyond, one can expect really a very rapid increase of processing capabilities moving forward. That's 2016, 2017, and so on. The processors are getting faster in the TVs, memory is getting cheaper, it's all driven by Moore's law. So you expect to see significant increase in capabilities. And this will allow rapid introduction of software-based capabilities, including things like perhaps multi-layer codecs, other kinds of capabilities moving forward. This, to some extent, advantages services that are delivered over IP that are not dependent on hardware interfaces which are difficult to update. So OTT services with new features that are backward compatible to existing and previously deployed television technologies will probably be able to stay abreast of these new trends. And then I think to summarize the CE industry perspective, we are really hoping that Ultra HD will not be the next 3D. It showed great promise, it had compelling value, but it didn't quite materialize. And this is not something that anyone wants to see with respect to HDR, white color gamut, etc. The launch of 4K displays really caught the studios and the networks, the MVPDs, the infrastructure vendors by surprise, and the rest of the industry wasn't quite prepared for this very quick development. Hopefully, HDR white color gamut has buy-in from all, and more importantly, moving forward, the rapid adoption of new technology by the CE industry, where the pace of innovation is so rapid and accelerating. New technology is now launching in 9 to 18 months, very similar to what you see in the cell phone area when it comes to deployment of new features. You're seeing that in the televisions now, and this is something that the industry is going to have to get used to. And we can definitely expect to see more disruption by non-traditional players, whether they be technology providers, service providers, app providers, content services, etc. So that is the end of my presentation. I hand it back to Barry in this case.
Yep. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Nandu. So it's now time for our question and answer session. For this, we're joined by a representative from the BBC, as I promised. He's Andy King, Head of Technology TV Productions at BBC Engineering. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this webinar.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I think since I've just introduced you, perhaps you could deal with the first of the questions. And can I ask the audience to please do take the opportunity to ask questions as well. The high dynamic range, which has been much mentioned, is the one element that seems to stand out here as giving the consumer a radically enhanced viewing experience. But how much is enough? Is it up to 1,000 nits, or is it higher? And perhaps if you fielded that one to begin with, Andy, and also remind everyone what a nit is in case they don't know.
Okay, so I might actually push this back to one of the gentlemen that you've just heard, but I mean broadly, a nit is a convenient way of saying a candela per meter squared, which is a measure of reflected brightness. What's enough? I think that's still under discussion, but I'm sort of sensing up to a couple of thousand might be plenty. I think something we still need to understand is the impact on the audience, and it was interesting just now to hear the 3D point. We forgot about the audience, I think, when it came to 3D. We understood it for the cinema, granted, and the audience is bought into that. And indeed, 3D worked for pretty much every vendor down the line, and also the content creator as well, because there was some fantastic, and still are some fantastic creative opportunities. But when it comes to brightness of screens, how long people can stare at them for, that's something certainly we still need to work through, that will play out in the standards. Super bright may be just too much for somebody to sit at, but obviously there's ambient lighting that relates to the particular viewing environment the individual is in. So it's a fairly waffly answer, I guess, to what underneath is a fairly complex question. Where are you sitting? What are you doing?
Okay, thanks. Matthew or and then Nandu, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So to go back to the original question, is 1,000 nits enough, or as Andy said, a convenient way of saying candelas per square meter, or do we need more? Well, it's a couple of factors in this. First thing, I think it's important to remind everybody on the call that high dynamic range isn't solely about the peak white level of the display being brighter. It's also simultaneously about keeping the dark areas of the screen true and dark, because it's not just cranking the brightness knob up on your television, because then your dark blacks will get all muddied and then turn gray. And it's really the sharp edges of the transitions between black and white that gives you the pop that you get with high dynamic range. So while simultaneously keeping the dark areas dark and the bright areas bright, there's research is still being done to find out what is enough nits, but it's also important to point out that the whole screen isn't brighter. What you're doing is you're emphasizing the highlights on the screen and making them much brighter in relationship to the dark areas to emphasize things, sort of like reflected light, which is known as basically one of the strongest ways of seeing the advantages of high dynamic range. You're walking through a parking lot, for instance, and you see the sunlight reflected off the paint in the cars and hit you in the eye, or reflections off of water in a river scene or the ocean, or you're at a sporting match and half of the arena is in shadow and the other half is in bright light, and the ball is kicked and it disappears because you can't capture both. This is really what is being looked at, and you have to also account for the home room viewing environment. If there's a lot of light in the viewing room, which is common at home unless it's nighttime, then you actually have to adjust a little bit for that. So most of us believe that 1,000 for high dynamic range as opposed to standard dynamic range, a good starting point is probably around 800 to 1,000 nits, and we're thinking that just for highlights, for very specular lights, very small amounts of the screen, you might want a peak white area in those very small amounts to be a bit higher than that. Just throwing numbers out, 1,500, maybe as much as 2,000 nits. But again, it's a point of diminishing return. The idea is to give emphasis to these small areas, which gives a much more realistic view, and that's really what it's focused on. And of course, the other reason why you don't want everything all lit up like that is you'll have to take an Energy Star symbol and put a red circle around it with a slash in it because it will use a lot of power. So obviously there's a challenge for consumer electronic manufacturers such as LG that Nandu represents in order to deliver a peak white level, keep the dark levels low, and give it in an energy efficient way as well. And there are some new technologies coming out there that are coming down now, as well as next few years maturing for that will help improve the peak white level of the display while keeping the darks black.
Nandu, do you want to comment?
Yes, I think contrast is really a good way to measure high dynamic range. It's a different term for improved contrast. Contrast is typically measured either in terms of a range of values or as a ratio or in terms of f-stops. And so as long as the viewer can perceive this wide dynamic range, then you have the experience that you want. So in very dark rooms, for example, in movie theaters, a high dynamic range experience may require only a brightness of up to 150 nits and no more. That's the existing, the new high dynamic range theaters that are out there don't really go much more than that. So it really depends upon what the viewer can perceive. And as Andy was saying, if it gets too bright, it really causes significant discomfort to the viewer. There are other aspects of high dynamic range and improved picture quality that are very important. That is, for example, just one example is viewing angle. Many of the high dynamic range displays have very poor performance with respect to viewing angle. So if you're off the center, your actual contrast decreases very rapidly, and so does color gamut. So the question is your experience for a single viewer? Is it for multiple viewers? And there are many, as I said, picture quality is a very difficult thing to define. HDR with respect to its grayscale performance is just one small aspect of this. Brightness is, again, just one small aspect of what we use to characterize these next generation of displays.
Thanks, Nandu. There were a whole bunch of questions that have come in about backward compatibility, which one of them is there is a lot of talk about the possibilities of backward compatibility to allow Ultra HD with HDR Plus to be backward compatible with older SDR sets. Is that possible? What's the downside? There's another related one is what do I need to do to receive HD HDR content in the next 6 months? A new HD display, a new HD HDR STP. There's a question about, isn't HLG, which was mentioned, only backwards compatible to Rec 2020 TVs, essentially today's 4K TVs? Skip, I wonder if you could kind of tease out the different kinds of compatibility that we're talking about here, because it's quite a complex picture, isn't it? About there's forwards compatibility as well as backwards. Could you illuminate what you think the various issues are in this area?
Right. It is perhaps the most challenging of anything we face right now, I think, and we feel may be one of the big values that the Ultra HD Forum may help to solve, in fact. But just to give a quick overview on it, we think of it as it's kind of 3 levels, and your questioners have kind of touched on all of them. But the first is obviously compatibility to SD displays. And this is really important for broadcasters particularly, but I think for everyone really. Content creators would like to not have to create multiple versions of their content. Ideally, you would have a single content channel, stream, broadcast that would address both legacy SD sets adequately and still have the color mapping and tone mapping and contrast to be appropriate and not look washed out or in other ways affected poorly, and the producer's intent be changed, as well as have that same stream through one method or another be appropriately displayed on an HDR display. And you will need a new screen in any case to add to that questioner's remark about what you'd really need. In any case, for HDR, yeah, you're going to need a new display. But the question is, for more broadly, how do you create the content to address both that display and the SD display? Secondly, we have 4K sets already out there, the first of the Ultra HD sets, and how do we make sure that future content that addresses the next gen of sets, which handle HDR, and how do we make sure that we also address those sets as well? So we have both SDR sets and early Ultra HD, in other words, let's call them just 4K sets, to make sure that those are both adequately considered when we put out HDR content and that looks good and it looks optimal on HDR sets. And then I guess the final element is, going forward, how do we make sure that we produce in a format that really does allow evolution? And I think maybe others might want to chime in on how they see the challenges of this, but I would finish by saying that these are all elements that standards bodies are grappling with right now. They're aware of them and are really trying to make sure that we get the most convenient, single, compatible system that both allows producers to really use this new toolbox of higher dynamic range and target those new sets that will be coming out, while not orphaning anything that's already out there, and certainly would represent the bulk of the market for some time to come.
I think it's important. I think it's important to point out that when we talk about HDR plus with HD or 1080p, we're really mostly focusing on a transmission format in order to save bandwidth in networks that have difficulty or have restricted bandwidth. We firmly believe there's not going to be production of new televisions that are going to be HD, HDR sets. They're going to be the 4K sets you see now. What will happen is they have pretty good up converters in them, and they'll take the 1080p signal, convert it to 2160p, do a very nice job in that, and they'll handle the HDR plus the wide color gamut and the 10-bit sampling precision as the capabilities of the new sets come out that handle those 3 aspects. And so it's really the exciting point about doing this with 1080p is you get a lot of the, so again, it comes back to that statement made earlier, a lot of the bang for the bit, by getting the HDR plus information out there, in a transmission that is much more bitrate efficient. But the televisions today, the 4K sets, and the ones that are going to be doing the HDR plus, the wide color gamut and 10-bit sampling precision, they'll take that, they'll upconvert to 1080p to 2160 to give you that immersive viewing experience on that. And again, if you have the bandwidth, you wouldn't need to do this. This is really what we're talking about is networks that necessarily can't afford to have multiple channels or of 2160p or 4K.
Related to that, Nandu, there was a question, how good is the upconversion going to be in 4K capable TV sets? Do you have a view on what it's like, or what it would be like?
Yes, the upconversion today is very good. I mean, you can see a small degree of softness between native 4K content and upconversion in TVs. I mean, it's discernible, but it's minor. A significant amount of the content that's available today from the Hollywood studios is in fact mostly upconverted, very professionally done offline. You know, you still get a perfectly fine viewing experience with HD that's upconverted to 4K. However, if you have good native 4K, you can see the difference. Really, it's up to the viewer to decide, you know, how much they want to pay for that extra discernible quality.
There's a question, with even the value of 4K resolution being questioned with respect to other dimensions such as HDR, I imagine that not much consideration has been given to 8K resolution. Is that correct? Matthew, is that one for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and Andrew can answer it as well. So, see, if you have a perfectly, just like when you set up a multi-channel audio system in your home and you go to a high-end or a place that does theater systems, and they spend time with you to make sure that you have proper placement of 5.1 or 7.1 or even more speaker channels in your room to enjoy the audio experience. When you're dealing with Ultra HD, you need to do the same for the television display itself, because the human visual system can only resolve so much resolution. So if you're talking about television as opposed to other applications, because there are many others, if you're talking about traditional television, which is one or more people, viewing content being displayed in a stream, right? Then it is the rule of thumb that has been out there for a 16:9 display roughly is to resolve all the resolution for HD, 1920 by 1080. You need to sit roughly around 3 picture heights away from the screen, and that's commonly where most people sit today. The challenge that happens with 4K or 2160p is that distance is halved in order for the average person to see all the resolution. It doesn't, these are rule of thumb. You don't have to sit exactly half, but what I'm saying is either your display has to be twice the size as your existing one, or your distance to the viewing of that display needs to be half the distance. And this is where it becomes a bit of a challenge in some areas. So if you take that even more so to 8K, while it's a great format in a large venue, you're now going to be down to the proper viewing distance being 3/4 of a picture height away. And that makes it even a bit more of a challenge, because obviously if you have a 60-inch display and you're 3/4 of a picture height away, you're almost sitting on top of the display. However, applications in larger venues, or if you have a touch wall and you're actually going up to the wall to touch it to look at things, that's where the higher resolution of 8K becomes valuable. But as far as television is concerned, it is correct. There's not a huge amount of value in that, in having it in a standard home viewing environment, simply because you'd have to be too close to the display in order to see all that resolution.
Okay, thanks for that. Nandu, did you want to pitch in as well? On 8K?
No, well, I mean, 8K, as Matthew was saying, 8K displays have various other applications that benefit from increased resolution. Even with respect to 4K TVs, you can see today that if you display a website or text or a document, it looks much better than it does on a HD display. So conference room applications, there are many applications for which 8K resolutions would really help. And so I don't know if a television broadcaster would want to broadcast in 8K, but maybe Skip can talk about that.
Yes, I just wanted to point out there that the folks that are really driving this hardest in the broadcast space are those at NHK. As many of the audience may know, their system called Super High Vision, which is intended for consumer launch in the next couple of years, and even broadcast by 2020, terrestrial broadcast. There'll be satellite broadcast before that. Their vision is, just as Matthew said, to hit that closer viewing approach, that 3/4 picture height, and that's because their vision with this, both for audio and video, is true immersiveness. And for immersion in the video sense, the one way to define it is that the image extends beyond the binocular field of vision, meaning that you don't really see or perceive the edges of the picture, which is something very unusual for us. We're typically used to seeing a section of the wall, a postage stamp even size image across the room. We typically don't sit at a distance from the image where we don't see the end of it, and that's their goal with 8K, and that's really that is for the consumer's experience. So I think that's a different behavior. It's not just a behavior for broadcasters or content creators. It's a different behavior for consumers. So whether or not that would be something that catches on is a question, I think, in many broadcasters' minds. And the other point there is, remember that amongst all these dimensions that we talked about, and I think Nando had that Pentagon display that shows the 5 dimensions, if you will, of image improvement in UHD or in any visual representation system. The one that costs the most with today's compression technology to deliver is that spatial resolution. And that's true with 4K, and obviously twice as true, or some multiple of that, true with 8K. So it's the hardest thing to deliver, but it may be the easiest thing for a set to at least approximate with upconversion. So we'll see. And a final point on this is there may be some professional applications for 8K, just as we're finding that 4K production helps you in your HD content down the road. You shoot in 4K, it gives you a little more flexibility of what to do with the image when you produce to HD. The same may be the case where we see 8K start to show up in professional production environments as imaging, as a storage format, or even an archival format that then can be down-resed to the delivery format. And it works better that way in many cases than just producing to the same spatial resolution that most of the audience has as your target display. So a number of elements in there with 8K for broadcast that we may see over time, at least on the pro side, and perhaps eventually, at least in some applications, making their way to the consumer side. But I think it's the last of any of these things that we're talking about to probably be realized in an end-to-end fashion.
Thanks for that. We haven't specifically mentioned, what public service broadcasters need to pay attention to with UHD. Andy, are there particular things that your remit obliges you to look out for in this migration process?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a real sense of deja vu. I'm sufficiently sadly old enough to remember the migration from SD to HD all those years ago. And the good thing is, I'll part the standards to one side. There's lots of discussions going on, and at some stage they will shake out, which is great. But we are into discussions with genres, particularly natural history, who will take 2 or 3 years to make a program as to what you do, because you wouldn't necessarily want to make something in UHD now. The public service remit means we can't just automatically go off and spend lots of money on new formats. We have to go through what's called a public value test, which is about making sure that the offering is right for the audience. However, you obviously need to be careful and to balance those sort of thinking with, so what do I need to think about if I'm filming now and I'm delivering in a couple of years? So we've got some advice going out to program makers who are in those sort of discussions. We're telling them, as far as possible, please record log in your camera. The nice thing, whether it's log, CS log, red log, or whatever, is that if you've got that and you've got those rushes, whatever HDR you are delivering in, for instance, you can generate from that. Obviously, there's going to be some management of the color. In fact, the term color management is not familiar to all program makers, and certainly we're doing that. We are saying don't just shoot everything big pixels, because you might find there's a limited period of time before HDR develops, and just have a really good think about your workflows. So we've done some tests and trials, and certainly some of you will obviously have seen the tech demonstrations at various shows. The big thing, no pun intended, it's the size of the files, moving them around, rendering them out is the challenge. The thing we have now that we didn't have in the early days of HD is that everything's software based. So the vendors are working very hard to make that work. But storage, it needs to be Thunderbolt, it needs to be USB 3. So we're really thinking about the practical way of just moving this stuff around, and obviously basing on the EPU tiering as far as possible to make sure we are filming with the cameras that, as far as possible, will allow us to generate something that's to UHD specification when the time comes.
Okay, thanks for that. One other thing that occurs to me we haven't really talked about, and maybe we should end on as we're coming up to the 1/4 mark, is next generation audio. So the question is, now that industry is more or less aligned around the set of new advancements that together make up the NGA next generation audio system, which are the ones which are resonating most with broadcasters, service operators, content creators, as their first obvious step into NGA? Matthew, do you want to deal with that one?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, the NGA system, which are the various versions that are resonating most with broadcasters and service operators?
Oh, okay, sure. So the next generation audio actually has 2 areas that are, and it depends on where how it's being handled. If you're doing like a large-scale, big-budget movie or an episodic series where you can do the production in advance, then immersive sound, which is really, I know we already have 3D sound now when you think of 5.1 or 7.1 surround, but the new immersive audio really has much more flexibility in the direction of the sound, including directly overhead and around you, which is emulated, but it's not perfectly done with the 5.1 and 7.1 channel surround. So they love that because it really gives a great, much more like you're sitting in the room or the environment or the field or wherever it is that this is being held. With direction on that. But if you're a live broadcaster, particularly with sports, and one of the other really great features of the new immersive audio is the personalization that it allows you to do. Because things are object-based, they can be individually controlled depending on the system. And one of the nice things about that is, I'm getting a little bit on the older side myself, sometimes the background noise of if you're at a sporting event of the crowd, I can't hear what I want to hear. If I want to hear the players moving around or grunting or something like that, or the smack of the ball against something, I need to turn down the background noise a little bit to hear it better. or in the case of even an episodic, if you have music coming up and there's dialogue, I can't hear the dialogue. I'd like to turn the dialogue up relative to that. So those two areas, the independent personalized controls over elements of the object-based audio, as well as the much more multi-dimensional height, is really the two areas that are very exciting about this next generation audio. And I should like to point this out, just like it's common today, even though you might have somebody set up this immersive environment that could say, if you're doing a beautiful production, you have 22 surround speakers and 2 subwoofers and et cetera like that. One of the things is it can also be emulated through using fewer number of speakers, because it can all be individually controlled with indirect firing and stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that can happen. Just like you fake out the human visual system, you could fake out the human oral system as well.
Right. Okay. So that seems like a good place to bring this to a close. There are tons of questions which have yet to be answered. I'm sorry about that for those of you who haven't had your particular questions answered. While I'm at it, those of you interested in keeping abreast of all of these developments, do please visit the Ultra HD Forum website. You can find it at ultrahdforum.org. That's http://ultrahdforum.org, and lots of current developments being posted there as they happen. Finally, it's just left for me to thank all of our 6 panelists for sparing the time out from their busy schedules on both sides of the Atlantic to contribute to this webinar. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And to the audience for attending this VideoNet webinar on UHD TV and putting your questions to the panelists. And from me, Barry Flynn, thanks for tuning in, and goodbye.